Hi everyone, welcome to today's PTRC Fireside Chat. Just a quick introduction about PTRC. We are a training company based in the UK which specialises in the training of transport planners, engineers, designers and placemakers. We are also part of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, the membership organisation for professionals leading the movement of goods and people. Since April, we've had 8 of these fireside discussions, leading to some great conversations. A big thank you to all of our panelists and Glenn for joining us again today. Joining us for which I'm sure will be a very topical and important discussion. I'll hand over to Glenn now.
Thank you very much, Brogan, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, my name's Glenn Lyons. I'm the Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility at UWE Bristol in the UK, and I really am delighted to be chairing this PTRC event, the latest in the series of our fireside chats. We've had around 550 people register for this event, and today we're turning our attention to the monumental challenge of decarbonising transport as quickly as possible. Very warm welcome to our audience. Do please make use of the chat window on YouTube to share your views and also raise questions you'd like our panel to address. And a warm welcome to our outstanding panel. But before we hear from them, I'd like to set the scene. Though I warn you, I may be setting a rather gloomy tone for panel members to respond to. This time last year, I was in New York, the last time I took a carbon-hungry flight. It was just weeks before the city would bear the brunt of COVID-19 hitting the United States. It was a surreal experience. I paid the £39 carbon offset for my flight to ease my conscience. I walked to work that week through a bustling Times Square to the office on Broadway. Having flown across the Atlantic to talk with people about strategic planning under uncertainty, I watched the news from that office of Greta Thunberg visiting my university city of Bristol in the UK, joined by tens of thousands of adults and children in the rain, taking part in the Youth Strike for Climate event. On the flight back, I watched the documentary film called The 11th Hour. It examines how we're affecting the Earth's ecosystems and what needs to change. At its end, my namesake, Oren Lyons, a Native American faithkeeper of the Wolf Clan, left me numb and emotional when he reflected on the havoc we've been wreaking on the planet, but ultimately on ourselves. He said, "What if we choose to eradicate ourselves from this Earth by whatever means? The Earth goes nowhere. There may not be people, but the Earth will regenerate. And do you know why? Because the Earth has all the time in the world and we don't." The film was harrowing to watch. Worse still, it's over 13 years old. We still seem to think we have all the time in the world. Now, I should warn you about things I more recently learned when I watched the December 2020 annual lecture of the Global Warming Policy Foundation. It seems you may be getting sucked into the relentless propaganda emanating from the ideology of climate change, an ideology of evil no less, one reflective of the perversion of environmental science. I was warned about the usual suspects saying that climate change could be worse than the pandemic. Local Transport Today interviewed the speaker and ran an article last month titled "Climate Emergency Agenda Regards Mobility as a Disease." So as time slips away and multiple vested interests and unaligned interests are at play amidst the discourses concerning climate change, what does the pandemic mean for all this? Earlier this week, the UK Prime Minister set out a roadmap to cautiously ease lockdown restrictions in England. What a contrast with the very different type of roadmap we need to rapidly bring about systemic change in the transport sector if we are to draw down levels of greenhouse gas emissions at the pace required. In July 2019, Professor Gillian Annabelle on our panel today delivered a keynote presentation to fellow academics. It had a big impact on me. It was titled "Rearranging Elephants on the Titanic." She offered a stark and unflinching analysis of the questions confronting the transport scientific community in the face of catastrophic climate change. I believe the Titanic remains a very apt analogy for now considering whether the pandemic will help or hinder transport's decarbonisation. After several largely unheeded warnings of danger ahead, the pandemic is the equivalent to delivering perhaps the last opportunity to the captain of the Titanic to change course before disaster strikes. Indeed, it could be seen as even forcing the ship to change course, at least temporarily. So is the temptation to reset the course or only slightly adjust the original course and maintain speed with faith in being unsinkable? Or does the precautionary principle demand that a more stark and sustained change of course is needed to avoid potential loss of life? Well, perhaps I'm being too dramatic to start this event off, exaggerating for effect, but perhaps not. Now, we're not here today to debate whether or not we face a climate crisis, but instead to consider whether or not we can achieve decarbonisation, at least in the UK, in less than 30 years, and specifically whether the global shock of COVID-19 is a friend or foe to the efforts required in the transport sector. In the exaggerated state of flux created by the pandemic, will it be possible to bring about the energy transition required in the transport sector across multiple modes and tens of millions of vehicles, including putting in place clean energy production and distribution infrastructure? Has our collective state of incarceration over many months, imposed by social distancing, helped us to appreciate our capacity to adapt to changing circumstances and to see the scope perhaps for new behaviours that tread more lightly? Or are the economy, livelihoods and people's mental health so battered that we will crave our old freedoms and resent any government looking to bring about uncomfortable, even if manageable, change? Well, perhaps a clue is in the overnight surge in flight bookings for foreign holidays following the PM's roadmap announcement this week. Are we going to let a good crisis go to waste? Has the pandemic helped perhaps in getting powerful players and influencers to pull in a new positive and bold direction of green recovery? Or are we destined to see squabbling, struggling, prevaricating and procrastinating in the ironic cause of self-preservation? And what of COP26 in Glasgow in less than 10 months' time? Is this perhaps the last chance to change the ship's direction? Well, as you can see, I've reverted to subjecting us all to a slew of questions while offering little in the way of answers. Thankfully, I'm now able to turn to our panel for assistance on this matter. So, without further ado, let's hear from them, starting with Gillian. Gillian, over to you.
Thanks very much, Glenn. I've just done the classic mistake. I really appreciate that, and I appreciate you mentioning the Titanic speech. So just hearing you say that was 18 months or more ago, and I'm afraid what I'm saying in many of these fora and so on is not that much different to what I was saying then, despite all of the calls for urgency. So first thing, the other thing I'd like to start off by saying as well is that I associate sitting by a fire with drinking whiskey. And I haven't yet opened this for today, but I may well do so if the conversation gets a little bit spicy as we go along, as I expect it will do. So climate change and COVID. Well, I don't know if we have a collective noun for crises. I think it's cluster something, I can't remember. But is this two crises? Is this a crisis squared? Is it a problem shared, a problem halved maybe? Or, you know, is two negatives going to actually make a positive? This is the question. But with respect to reducing carbon emissions, there are a few really important things the only things in my mind that really matter, that we have to start to talk about those and get those right before we can get into some of the other detail that we tend to look at because we think that's a good news story, and it can distract us, in my view. So firstly, will the really immediate and very visible hardships from economic turndown mean that we're going to have economic recovery at any cost? And particularly with respect to what we're talking about today, will the green recovery be car-led? And we can reference Sunak's statement this week about wanting to ease the burden for car users who have had to be more dependent on their cars, apparently, this year, even though we've been in a lockdown and haven't had so many places to go. Or is it going to be aviation-led? And there I reference an aviation spokesperson on Radio 4 yesterday morning. I really do not know why I listened to the radio first thing in the morning. And he said, apparently, aviation has led Britain out of every previous recession. So that suggests, well, we must really have to thank those 15% of people that are responsible for 75% of the flights. How very altruistic of them to bring us out of recession. Thank you very much. The other important thing is whether the holes in our public finances will lead to less expenditure on carbon-fueled infrastructure projects. And I think you know what I'm referring to when I say carbon-filled infrastructure projects in this context. Another thing, will the travel demand changes that have happened due to lockdowns make it easier to accept social adaptability? Glenn referenced this, but do we suddenly think that people are adaptable, that can change when they need to, or actually might it be the opposite? That it will actually be harder to impose restrictions on car use, on travel, on the amount of travel, because that harps back to the kind of hardships and the difficulties that we've had this year. And by the way, I've heard that said from members of the public in recent climate assemblies, this idea that the idea of staying local and having to reduce their travel is actually right at this moment a particularly difficult thing to talk about. It always was, and now it particularly is. Will the downturn in public transport patronage, particularly buses, and that was happening before COVID, will it lead to a step change in the way public transport is now governed and operated? That is what needs to happen. That is one of the overarching important things. And around aviation and leisure, yes, international leisure may be dampened despite the upsurge just in the last few days. It still may be dampened. But what then does that mean for domestic leisure and long distance journeys, which actually are responsible for the majority of carbon from our personal transport? So they're the really big questions that matter for emissions. And we can talk about the idea that everyone's going to be working from home. Of course, everyone, that's a nonsense. But even when we talk about working from home, we have to think about the additional energy demands in the home, what the offices are going to be used for, and so on. Can I just have another minute?
Go for it.
Okay. We can talk about the rejuvenation of neighbourhoods, including walking and cyclable neighbourhoods, but we have to accept that even our nearest neighbours on the continent that have embraced this concept for decades have seen transport be the only sector in their economies where emissions are still rising. And that's because they haven't reined in the car, that car use has grown to fill in the space available, and cars themselves have grown to fill in the parking spaces available in terms of their sizes. So we can't just look at certain things which we think are good. We have to look at things in the round and see where the majority of the carbon is situated. And the maths are very easy. Even if every single person who bought a car from tomorrow bought purely electric vehicle, we couldn't get to where we need to get to by 2030. That's really the target we need to be looking at least a 50% reduction for the transport sector by 2030. And that's letting the transport sector off lightly. You do the maths and you cannot get there with the technology. So we have to talk about a car reduction target, which we're going to hear about Scotland. They've bitten the bullet. But until we talk about that as a target, everything else that we talk about in relation to personal travel is actually not talking about what we actually need to do. So that's my main priority for today, to really talk about how we can get that target accepted and then talk about what that means to achieve it.
Thank you, Gillian. That's great. Let's move straight on to Andrew. I think we'll have something to say about aviation.
I will have something to say about aviation, but I do hope we're going to come back to public transport, because I think actually the pandemic opens up some really kind of interesting, radical opportunities for public transport. But I am actually going to talk about aviation. Many of the pandemic effects, as we know, have accelerated existing trends, but almost all the trends in aviation have been reversed by the pandemic. This is actually one of the few beneficial effects of the pandemic, as the kind of the aviation industry being pushed into reverse gear. And obviously, the pre-pandemic projections for aviation were they're going to be 60% global growth by 2050. At the moment, passenger levels are running at the levels of the 1970s, which are a fraction of what they were. And Gillian's already talked about aviation spokesmen appearing on the radio. I mean, when I read the Financial Times in particular, I do see a lot of people in the aviation sector who are basically whistling in the dark to keep themselves cheerful about the prospects or not. And most of the time, they're actually there's a bit of a sharp intake of breath, bit of sucking the cheeks when they're actually talking about those prospects. A lot of things are being pushed back further. A lot of their assumptions about recovery are being pushed back further. And obviously that matters because there is no credible way to zero emissions for long-haul aviation by 2050 outside of the completely murky world of offsetting. We have a limited ability to reduce emissions through new technologies. You know, we might, on almost the best projections, get to medium-sized planes, you know, probably fueled by hydrogen. Airbus has given up on the battery, it seems, doing medium-range distances. You know, maybe London to Istanbul might be good for it. And one of the kind of consequences of the pandemic is that airlines are now indebted to governments everywhere. You know, instead of being kind of free riders on pretty much every sort of tax system and regulatory system, actually some governments somewhere have actually started imposing conditions on the future support. So, you know, I know what the data says. The data says that domestic aviation in some places has recovered, not to where it was, but it's recovered a bit. International aviation so far not really recovered at all. It might come back, but those aren't really the noises you see when you look at the kind of current statements from places like Heathrow and Airbus. And I think that, you know, immediately it's going to be slow. You know, borders are going to remain uneven for some time to come. You know, no matter how well vaccinated the UK is, there's lots of countries in the world that aren't going to be vaccinated for quite a long time to come. And the other thing that's going on here, I think, especially for business travel, which is obviously the most profitable part of aviation, is that one trend that probably has been accelerated by the pandemic is kind of the reluctance of business people to travel for the sake of it, for you know, a quick flight to do a meeting. That was already happening before the pandemic, to do with family trends and stuff like that. Maybe a sort of a reducing commitment to the kind of the needs of the firm. I think we're, which obviously causes quite a lot of issues for business models. I also think that we're probably going to see the Biden administration in particular start sort of taking carbon taxes seriously. You know, some projections say that they might take that to $100 a ton by 2030. So it's a bit grey, but I think my own bet is that aviation is not going to come back to the kind of projection levels we saw before the pandemic. We're not going to see that 60% growth. It's still going to be a problem. People are still going to be flying long haul with no green alternative. But actually, thank God for the pandemic, really, because aviation was a problem that we didn't have any solutions to before it.
Thanks very much, Andrew. We'll move straight on to Claire. Still hunting for good news, Claire. What can you give us?
I haven't got any good news. First of all, thank you so much for bringing us all together. This is an absolutely brilliant kind of framing of the problem and great discussion. So yeah, so my thoughts, I mean, well, clearly COVID-19 has turned the world upside down, and you know, the long-term impacts in terms of how we live our lives, you know, structural changes to the economy, they're going to be profound. The question for today is, you know, are these impacts going to help or hinder global efforts to tackle climate change? Clearly, prior to the pandemic, we were way off course. Economic shutdowns may have delivered the sorts of levels of reductions needed, but by definition, they're not economically sustainable. So, you know, reflecting, you know, what have we learned so far? The pandemic has certainly emboldened the active travel agenda, and the ease with which large parts of the economy have transitioned to digital does hold the prospect of big potential savings long term. But against that, we have to see there is a very real risk of a car-led recovery. The avoid public transport message means that the net shift has been from public transport to private car. The 2030 ban on the sales of new petrol and diesel cars is clearly welcome, but we, as Gillian has already said, we will absolutely need to reduce the volume of traffic on our roads. I mean, projections from anywhere between 20 and 60% by 2030. So we're going to need a massive shift from private transport to public, shared and active travel. And a public transport sector on its knees is hardly going to be in a position to play its part in delivering that shift. I think, the dramatic reduction in flying was another good thing for a while, but as has already been commented, I mean, this is short-lived, and the rush to be booking flights. I mean, I've seen projections suggesting that the sector will recover by 2024-25. Obviously, air passenger duty urgently needs reform along a lot of other aspects. But sort of beyond these direct impacts, I think the pandemic has shone a light on fundamental changes needed in how we plan for transport. Clearly, digital connectivity has grown massively. There's a powerful case for investing that 27 billion roads budget on broadband, but this must go alongside a more efficient system for freight and logistics. Otherwise, growing internet shopping will bring our roads to a standstill. I mean, the pandemic has shown that we need to be much better prepared for systemic shocks. I hope that's a learning that we will take. I think there's likely to be an increased focus on risk and resilience. Influential select committees are now warning that if we don't grow back better, as they're saying, the climate change and biodiversity impacts may deliver an even greater crisis. And the point's been made that there's a proven link between air pollution and higher mortality rates from COVID-19. These same committees are calling for a concerted campaign to get people back onto public transport once the pandemic's over. I mean, I think the lessons are all there. The question is whether we're able to see and importantly act on what COVID-19 has taught us. Transport's not an end in itself, and decarbonisation needs to be thought of in the context of the wider economy and across all enablers of economic activity. We need a whole systems approach to decarbonisation. We need to reform transport appraisal, funding and governance so that cities can plan for housing, transport, or areas can plan for housing, transport and jobs on an integrated long-term basis. Technical solutions will not be sufficient. We also need behaviour change. The transition to net zero must be fair and equitable, and that means that we must protect public transport, but also that EVs are affordable for all. And clearly pricing will be critical. We've got to internalise external costs. So as poll out today finds that 2/3 of people see that carbon tax is a fair way to raise money. It's encouraging that the PM has instructed all government departments to draw up proposals to put a price on carbon. The challenge, of course, will come when these proposals come into direct collision with reality. The fact that successive governments have failed to put a price on the penny of fuel, a penny on the price of fuel duty for over a decade, despite record low oil prices, is an indication of just how difficult this is going to be.
Wow. Thank you, Claire.
Sorry.
Still no good news. Okay, Brendan, can you offer us something from the Scottish perspective, perhaps? Thank you, Claire.
Well, I hope the gloom hasn't got to the extent where Gillian's got the single malt out quite yet. But as an acting public servant, I'm stuck with the tea for today, I think. Yeah, I mean, reflections in Scotland run through a bit, and I mean, has the pandemic affected this agenda? I think undoubtedly, as it has across, everything that underpins society, both in the UK and globally. I mean, Scotland published just at the tail end of last year a climate change plan update, which was created in the middle of the pandemic. I mean, we've got very stretching statutory targets in Scotland, and during the passage of the bill, which led to those, there was a commitment to refresh and update our climate change plan. So that's across all sectors, not just transport, and I think has led to quite a lot of looking in Scotland at how transport, particularly road transport, interacts with wider policy agendas, be that digital, be that placemaking, and the kind of derived nature of why people move about. Most people don't go for a kind of run in the car as a sort of leisure pursuit, although there may be some indications during COVID that's something that's ratcheting up a bit. So that was published last tail end of last year and is going through various parliamentary committees at Holyrood at the minute. So there are quite a lot of interesting views coming forward from opposition parties, but also just civic society in Scotland, business, industry and others. I suppose for transport, I think, as Gillian sort of alluded to at the start, the most eye-catching and the one that's garnering the most attention is a policy outcome to reduce car kilometres by 20% by 2030, which I think we're under no illusion is particularly ambitious and challenging. But as we've heard from those that preceded me, and the sort of global emergency and the rate that action is needed to take is crystallising minds. I think that builds on. I mean, we've got a national transport strategy in Scotland that already set an agenda that we really need to get, particularly single occupancy car use down. We need to move towards public transport and active travel where possible, and EVs where that is amenable to people. Undoubtedly, the pandemic has affected these things. I mean, public perceptions of public transport and the usage of it, the amount of government subsidy necessary to keep it going during the pandemic, and what that will recover like, and what public attitudes will be in the legacy to getting onto public transport in close proximity to a lot of people. I think that will be replicated across various things in society as we move out of the pandemic. How will people in different age groups, different demographics go back to what was there before, or will they at all? I mean, during the pandemic in Scotland, there's been a lot of initiative about funding commitments on reallocation of road space towards bus, towards active travel. Quite a bit that we're doing around not so much home working, but remote working, can hubs that are shared by different organisations, different professions that are perhaps not, they're not owned or operated by one institution, but they're a sort of shared community asset. Could something like that pay dividends? I think, as Gillian also touched on, there is that trade-off. I mean, these might mean transport emissions move out of transport, but what does that mean in terms of heating, lighting, and actual overall energy consumption? So I suppose on that front, we have a commitment to publish a route map to look at this in 2021. The backdrop of the pandemic is sort of ever present. We've also got an election coming up in Scotland in a couple of months, and quite big political issues swirling around. However, the aim is to publish a route map this year. I think we're under no illusion that this will not, it will not be able to just be carrots. There will need to be sticks within that. There needs to be quite stark action to try and disincentivize private car use, discourage it, look at people not seeing it as the first port of call, particularly single occupancy. But we've got the added complication in Scotland, I think, of quite a rural and dispersed population, particularly in some parts that are very reliant on the car. So there will have to be quite a lot of consideration of how something like that impacts on different areas. As I say, Parliament's due to report on all this, I think, in the coming weeks. So we'll see what comes out of that. We'll also see manifestos in Scotland. The statutory targets that we have are across parliamentary commitment. So it kind of remains to be seen, I suppose, the next political cycle of how that actually crystallises itself in offerings from the various parties should be coming out within the coming weeks as well. So there's quite a lot going on in Scotland, and quite an interesting backdrop to all these questions.
Great, thank you, Brendan. We'll move straight on to Rachel, who's going to take us certainly from up in the skies that Andrew gave us, I think, to down very much on the ground. Rachel, over to you.
Brilliant, thanks, Glenn. And yeah, I am director of the Active Travel Academy, so my talk is going to be slanted towards that. But I would start off by saying that clearly a wide range of policies are needed. We need system change, and growth in active travel is clearly not the only or even the main thing. I've always been kind of a bit nervous about claiming too much for active travel. You know, the idea of it being a miracle pill makes me feel a little bit nervous, partly because of the implication of a technical fix, and partly because clearly what we need goes a long way beyond replacing 5-mile car trips to the supermarket with 5-mile bike trips to the supermarket. And while active travel has many co-benefits, different co-benefits may pull against each other. So often we assume that mode shift is the key goal of getting more people walking and cycling, but then we potentially downgrade the impact active travel can have among those with currently restricted mobility. So potentially for low-income people who are currently not travelling, being able to cycle may make a massive difference to their lives, and potentially the acceptance of restrictions on car use. But it doesn't necessarily reduce carbon emissions. Having said that, the rise of emergency active travel schemes, I think, is really interesting. So, for instance, something I'm looking at the moment is low traffic neighbourhoods in London. So within 6 months of last year, 4% of people in London were covered by low traffic neighbourhoods, which restrict motor traffic in residential streets. That's 300,000 people. That's really quite substantial. And we've been doing some research into longer standing low traffic neighbourhoods in Waltham Forest with very, very interesting results. And one thing I wanted to share with you is that we found a 6% decline in car ownership after 2 years, as well as over 2 hours a week more active travel. So, that to me was very impressive, that these low traffic neighbourhoods in Waltham Forest led to a decline in car ownership, which, as you can see, would have knock-on effects on the longer trips, that it's also very important, longer car trips, that it's also really important to reduce in terms of the carbon benefits, because people don't own a car. That then leads on to wider changes. Another learning from the COVID emergency measures, I think, and I'd recommend people read Ollie Wainwright's really nice Guardian piece today on children's play, which I think is relevant. Active travel measures considered widely are a way of giving something back. So, if we're expecting people not to use cars, not to buy cars, there has to be something in it for them. It can't just be restrictions. If we're expecting parents not to drive kids across the city to the park, then we need to give back informal play opportunities in local streets. And the evidence shows that active travel is good, not just for health, physical health, but also well-being. So enabling people to walk and cycle is a benefit, and it's so important to be able to offer people these benefits. Of course, the challenge, as we know in relation to low traffic neighbourhoods and so on, is that disruption, which is how we get behaviour change, is not immediately popular. However, one final positive point to make on this is that in the controversy around low traffic neighbourhoods, there is a growing acceptance that excessive motor vehicle travel is a problem in many of these debates. So a lot of the opposition is framed around it's not fair that people have to put up with negative impacts of motor vehicle travel, of other people's motor vehicle travel. So, I see that as in some regards a positive, that there is a debate opened up now around the externalities of motor vehicle travel that perhaps weren't there before. So, this is also a reason to talk about active travel. I think that it can open up those debates. And I think I'll just stop there before Glenn waves a piece of paper at me. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Rachel. Yeah, encouraging from humble beginnings. 4% could grow if we let it, very substantially, with huge effects, I would imagine. Our last member of the panel to set their introductory remarks out is Bob, who will be no stranger to the many issues that have been raised, but who certainly carries the huge challenge of what to do with all of that in his day job. So Bob, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Glenn, and thanks everybody else for setting me up like this. I was described as the author of the Transport Decarbonisation Plan this morning by somebody. I think the Secretary of State and Ministers might have something to say about that. But anyway, afternoon, everybody. Bob Moran, Deputy Director in the Department of Transport, and I head up our Environment Strategy team. And I guess as a civil servant, I play an unusual role now in that I get to play politician, yeah? So I can repeat all of the messages that I think have gone down well, or seem to have gone down well with everybody, and play them back to you, the audience, get some brownie points for that, make everybody on the panel feel as if they're right. Okay, so that should help you through the next hour, hopefully. So COVID, is it friend or foe? Well, the politician's answer, of course, is both, of course, isn't it? Friend or foe for decarbonisation, it's got to be both. What I'll probably do over the next minute or so is just hint at some specific policies that you will know and recognise, and that might have been mentioned before, without actually saying whether I'm in favour or not of them. But ever was the role and the life of a civil servant, and I guess that's a bit more politician for you there than you might have been expecting. So before I say anything else, COVID has been a horrible time for so many people, and thank you to all the transport heroes in particular out there who have been doing such a great job. This is going to go on for a long time, so I feel hope. There is hope, but this is something that we're going to be dealing with for a long time. And I think, well, right, it's forced a lot of people to think about certain aspects of their life quite differently. And I don't think that that is a bad thing. And I think that time hopefully has been well spent. We mentioned holidays. It has forced people to think about their holidays. Not being allowed to go forces you to think. But potentially this year, holidaying at home. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. It's caused a lot of people to reimagine the high street. And I think this is something that I like a lot. And I like this a lot, not just from a professional perspective, but from a home perspective, from where I live. More space for me as I go shopping or as I go out to the pub or to restaurants is a good thing. More space for people to eat outside. A little bit less space for vehicles. I like that in my local area. And my council appears to like that, because just on Monday they announced that they were starting the scheme in Westminster again to open up streets for restaurants and for businesses, because it was so successful last year. And they're doing that on the 12th of April, and it's going to run to the end of October. And I hope that which kind of started last year as a result of the pandemic, is an even bigger success this year and goes on for even longer. Frankly, I can't wait to get back to the pub, whether it's inside or out. So on things like that, COVID has allowed us to try. I'm not going to use the word experiment, although I've said it now. It's allowed us to try a certain number of things en masse, rather than thinking about it, or rather than just talking about it. I think I'll extend that into mobility options, that have come about as a result of COVID. I'm going to pick e-scooters, which the number of trials, and they will be a success, and I'm sure they will lead to more use of e-scooters in the future. But that kind of thing has been good for decarbonisation in the long run. If not measurable in the short term, I think it will have had a short-term impact. But in the long run, I think that kind of new way of thinking about transport, providing more options, providing alternatives to getting in the car, which are better for people. That's the way I see that we can get around this such a heavy reliance on cars and the private car. Slightly longer term, I think on the technology side, then I think the strong case for building back better and big investment in there has solidified, and it hasn't gone away. So I think to wrap up, as many of you who are watching will know, we've been putting together a plan to decarbonise all of transport. We've been doing that over the course of the last year. In lockdown one, the end of March, we released our gobsmacking, thanks Stephen, first part of that is a gobsmacking vision for the future of transport. And we've been working ever since throughout that. The Prime Minister's 10-point plan, which came out in November, had a, I guess you could say, a sneak peek or a lot of the heavy lifting in it. If you want to decarbonise transport, then you've got to tackle emissions from cars and vans and then extend that to the rest of the vehicles. So we said we were going to extend from cars. We not only brought forward the phase out date from 2040 to 2030, but we said we were going to extend it to trucks. Don't be surprised in the transport decarbonisation plan if you see it extended to other road vehicles that we haven't talked about yet. And strangely, this period of disruption hasn't been a bad time to sort all this out and get things together. I don't know what the long-term impacts of travel that COVID's going to have on travel. Okay, I just don't know that. It's very difficult to plan out to 2050, but it was difficult anyway. There's loads of uncertainty. And I think the best thing, to generally wrap up now, the best thing that has come out of this for me is, as I've thought about what we're going to talk about today, I've tried to step away from the detail of the plan, which I have been writing this morning and will continue to draft this afternoon, is that the global emergency without a vaccine, which is climate change, hasn't gone away. It hasn't dropped off the agenda during all of this. In fact, it's right on up there. And I think in future years, we will look back at this time and say, gosh, well, that was the time that we can pinpoint when we really got to grips with climate change, the year of COP in Glasgow and all of that kind of stuff. And hopefully the transport decarbonisation plan, it was a step change. It signalled that people had got a grip and pushed through a change. And you did all of that at the same time as you were dealing with COVID as well. And I think people will look back genuinely and go, blimey, what a busy time that was. And it is. And I think that's where I wanted to finish today. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Bob. And I think you did a very good job in giving us at least opening up the fact that there's uncertainty about whether the glass is half full or half empty, and indeed, of course we know it's uncertain ahead, and how we will look back on this current period of time we're all living through. I was very struck across all your remarks, introductory remarks, but also looking at the many questions and comments coming from participants, that in some respects, this is all about the sort of transport planning that many of us have talked about for most of our careers. And when I think about super fast broadband, it seems that what we're asking for now really is super fast transport planning. We've got to play catch up on all the many things that we would have wanted to see happen much sooner, when we're talking about livable neighborhoods, when we're talking about reducing the energy footprint of the vehicles that we are using, improving the efficiency of the system. Various comments in the chat bar about equity, which of course, Gillian's point about economy first, equity tends to be at the bottom, but actually both those need to come forwards together. And the other 2 points that struck me, first of all, is, although Bob sails closest and Brendan, but we're not politicians. And I wonder, for all of the insight that we have, how each of you would react if you were suddenly catapulted into Secretary of State shoes and told to bear the brunt of all those vested interests that are lobbying for slowing things down, protecting businesses, and so on, which may run counter to your own aspirations. How would you cope? Are we guilty of being on our high horses to some extent in expanding the severity of the challenge, without being empathetic enough and understanding how we really help the politician make a difference? But the last point I make, and I welcome a reaction from any of you on that point, is when we talk about technology, the saying goes, technology tends to happen more slowly than we expected it to in the short term, and then it happens much more rapidly than we could have imagined in the longer term. Do you think this super fast transport planning might follow suit? It's only 2 years ago, I think, that pre-Greta, many of us, even including myself, I might admit, were not as caught up and anxious and passionate about the agenda that we're now talking about today. It's only been 2 years. I know it's 2 years, 30 years too late. But do we think there is some optimism if we go forwards another 5 years, that there will be a real momentum building up? If this, as Bob says, in spite of COVID, there has been an ability to maintain an attention on climate change. Sorry, rather a collection of reactions to your comments, but Andrew, you want to come in?
Sorry, Glenn, thank you for asking about 3 questions there, but I'm only going to focus on one. And the one I'm going to focus on is what you should be saying to politicians. Because the fact is that actually the whole agenda and climate around green business and green investment has changed really, really radically in the last 2 or 3 years, from being, this is still a cost, to actually, and this is not, this isn't me speaking as somebody who's a kind of somebody who believes in, responding to climate change. This is just people looking at it from a business lens. So people like McKinsey are kind of putting out reports which say, actually, we can't afford not to do this investment now. There's an interesting report from Systemic, who looked at the way in which business models have been affected by the changes that had happened since the Paris Agreement. And they said, well, actually, we're seeing at the moment about 25% of business sectors are open to cost-effective new business models, which are green business models. And by the time we get to 2030, that's going to be 75%. So what we should be saying to, and also obviously we're sitting in a flood, trillions and trillions of dollars of money washing around the global economy at sub-zero interest rates, looking for somewhere that you can actually get a return. So what we should be actually saying to the politicians is, this isn't actually about vested interest, this is about rebuilding the economy. Even if you don't care about climate change, this is the best and quickest way to rebuild the economy in a kind of a fair way. It's not just about building back better, it's actually the best way to build back.
Yeah. Is that, Gillian, are you going to build on that in an optimistic way? Or do you
was actually, I completely agree with that. But what, I suppose what we need to be trying to understand is the fact that what you've just said there, Andrew, the evidence does exist for that. There's more and more evidence about how the green economy can be just as ride us into the future in a positive way. And so my big question is, how do we actually get to a situation, I mean, imagine this situation, right? We have a climate crisis, we have a crisis, and we start to count the implications of that crisis on a daily basis. Maybe it runs along a ticker tape along the bottom of the news. And maybe every day there's a press conference where politicians are flanked by scientists actually saying what the evidence is telling us and why we're taking certain actions. I mean, the thing that I'm really interested in, but it's not sort of my area. I can't possibly sort of branch off into understanding this, but I'd really like to understand what the impact of COVID has been on the way in which science is taken into policy and the way the public expects or would accept more science being communicated and taken into policy, because it seems to me that there's all kinds of evidence that is not taken on board with respect to policymaking and hasn't been for decades. And so I don't want to be a politician. I couldn't cope with being a politician. It's why I'm an academic. But as an academic, I really need to understand how to bite this opportunity that may possibly exist to have more trust taking place between policymakers and the evidence bringers.
Anyone else on the panel able to imagine themselves as a politician, or talk about this issue of the velocity of change? Are we looking ahead at a sort of S-curve of development along this agenda, so that we're struggling at the moment at the very bottom, and that of course would include EVs, but more generally in this systemic change. But of course that will pick up if we follow the S-curve, and if we can steepen the curve, could change very rapidly. Do you have any optimism in that respect? And can you see how the politicians would ensure that steepness of the curve?
So if I may, actually, I had a point sort of related to this.
Yeah, far away, Claire.
You've kind of gone off in a slightly different direction to where I was going, but it was just the point of the message of hope, which I appreciated hearing from Bob. And I think that the point you made, Glenn, around the challenge and are we being fair to our politicians? Are we helping, providing that evidence, but also helping in actually understanding just how difficult it is to make some of these really tough decisions. I mean, another reflection, despite, I'm trying to sort of keep positive and the half full, but it is a bit depressing when you hear, for example, Vivid Economics did its analysis that came out last month that showed, despite all the talk about building back better, the vast majority, a very small proportion of stimulus spending has been on green. So despite government stating this, I mean, it's too easy to default to what people are used to spending. But there is still time, and we do need to believe and believe that we can do it. But it's going to be tough. But I think I just wanted to reflect in that we do, sitting outside of the tough area of making those decisions. I think we need to provide as clear evidence as we can that can really cut through, because that message doesn't seem to be being received at the moment sufficiently.
I mean, Bob, yes, I'll bring in a moment. I mean, Gillian's point about the role of scientists. I'm conscious earlier this week of anti-vaxxers being on the news. And here's a situation, coming to Bob's point, where we don't have a vaccine for climate change. We have a vaccine which the scientists have said have worked. And yes, most people are taking the vaccine because they can see the proximate benefits. But remarkably, there are still people who are able to be duped by the way the media is manipulated into believing this is a conspiracy. So imagine the problems ahead, perhaps, that we're going to face with climate change. It's not proximate yet for many people, particularly the wealthy elites. And yet we've got climate change denial. We've got it being promulgated in different circles to this one. Is there going to be a real problem in people understanding the need for change without seeing the effect on their lives at the moment of not rising to that challenge? Perhaps I'll come to Bob. It might not be the question you were going to pick up, but
gosh, yeah, and I might dodge it, Glenn, as well, to be honest. But I'll have a think about that while I speak. I'm going to give some more hope, hopefully, and optimism in a second. But I think the views So I'm not a politician, but the views of politicians here so much, and all of the views of those people, are valid. I'm not going to suggest anti-vaxxers, but in this kind of space, if you're a politician, if you're a government minister, you receive all sorts of excellently drafted the science kind of advice in your day to day, and then you build up to a new policy or something, and you put it out on Twitter. And just if you haven't look at any politician's announcement on Twitter and see what people's reaction and people's responses. It would appear as if no minister can ever do anything right. Certainly would never do anything to please anybody, and that's difficult. And I've done many events, but I did an event sometime mid of last year when we were doing some work on stakeholder engagement for the decarb plan, and I asked the minister in front of an audience, about how that felt, and I think it was in reaction to low traffic neighbourhoods. Everybody, those that don't like it shout loud, and that is the response that people hear. And it's so hard for those that do like it to not just make their voice heard, but feel that they are able to to balance that off. And I think it's so important. It has been so important that those messages are equally as valid but don't necessarily get through because they're not made in the same way. It's difficult to kind of reconcile. But as a politician, all views are valid, I would imagine, and you've got to kind of balance that out. I think my drop in for hope right now, and it is COVID related, is let's think about the change that's going to come over the next 9 years. We've got less than 1% of the fleet of passenger of our road vehicle fleet of tens of millions of vehicles that have a plug. That's going to change. It's going to take quite a few years, but that's going to change quite dramatically over the next 9 years as vehicle manufacturers finally embrace battery electric vehicles and zero emission vehicles and bring them to market and actually encourage customers to buy them. That's going to the private investment. I agree with Andy and Andrew is there. You're going to see charge points coming thick and fast, hopefully where they're needed. Thank goodness that's happening now after we have hopefully answered some really serious questions about actually where we want those cars to be. Do we want all of those cars charging up down our high streets kind of thing, or actually do we want to preserve those spaces? It would have been so much more difficult to do what hopefully a lot of city and town centres are going to do this summer and pedestrianise and bring shops and retail and hospitality out onto those streets. It'd have been an awful lot more difficult if car owners were relying on those spaces to charge their cars. So that's my one bit of hope. Just before charge points arrive everywhere, we've hopefully preserved some space for people and for bikes.
Yeah, and of course it goes without saying that the challenge here is we're dealing with such a multiplicity of parallel change that's needed with all the interrelations between it, that it does really escalate to becoming a truly wicked problem, and therefore it's incredibly difficult to get a sense of solving it ever or even progress towards a solution. Brendan, you've got your hand up, and then perhaps Rachel, you might like to have a bit of airtime, and then we'll come to some questions we'd had from the audience before we got underway today. Brendan, over to you.
Yeah, just quickly, I suppose, on that point about influencing government and parliaments in general. I mean, like Bob, I'm not a politician, and it's a bit of a thorny issue for a civil servant. But I think Andrew's point is very, very well made, that characterising things not as economy versus environment and where there are opportunities for mutual gain will obviously always resonate well, I think, with sitting ministers. I mean, we've got there's a lot of opinion polling, I suppose, showing that the young ministers and all politicians are very alive to public opinion. Like Bob's saying there, you've just got to look at the vast swathes of different views that are expunged on anything that's announced. But I mean, there are a lot, the different demographics and age groups of where climate rates. I think one of the challenges is managing to articulate what people looking to see climate action taken translates to in their daily lives and their lifestyle behaviours and their individual choices that are made every day. And transport's a very good example of that, and how entrenched these things are, how ingrained some choices are. But I suppose as well, taking the public with you is always going to be very alive for ministers, and having a cross-party agreement on what the science says and where things are. I mean, we had in Scotland last year a Transport Act a bill that went through Parliament, and it was one of the first. We've not really had a big multi-topic bill for about 14 years like that. During our agreement with the Green Party, there was workplace parking levy measures introduced to it at stage 2, which is on the statute books down south, but I think only Nottingham have ever used it. But the political dialogue that triggered, and the backlash from things like the Daily Mail, we had a campaign, 8 days of splash, news splashes, poll tax on wheels, all this very emotive language on what was a fairly modest discretionary option for local authorities, I think shows the challenges for any sitting government, as well at Parliament, as well as in public opinion, of taking things forward and managing to characterise them as part of the climate emergency agenda, and not being seen to just be infringing on people's what they see to be their habits and their daily lives, because we do live in a democracy after all.
And as you were talking, I'm not sure I can quite justify why the thoughts come to my mind, but only yesterday I saw reference to, and I forget which of the London boroughs, but there was talk of something like a £600 to £700 charge for a motorist to have to park their car outside their house. Hardworking motorists, unable to have the basic liberty to put their car out there without being charged this extortionate amount, which somebody quickly worked out was amounted to something pitifully small, like £1.80 a day for a piece of real estate in the heart of the global financial capital. Rachel, that kind of takes me to you in terms of the very local and what's going on there.
Sure, and I was thinking, listening to some of the comments and questions and so on, that one of the things that we can learn from the current period as well is perhaps about communicating change, and the way in which local authorities have not just been putting in place temporary schemes and so on, but they've also had to experiment with communication, new ways of engagement. And some of this has been very difficult, some of it's been more successful than others. But one of the things that I've often thought in the past has been, when cuts had been made in terms of transport planning, often the people who could communicate schemes lost their jobs. And we ended up, I've seen, transport engineers, who are obviously very skilled people, try and explain schemes to the public and struggle because that's not their skill set. And the fact that we do need people who are skilled facilitators, skilled communicators, and so on. And one of the positive things I've thought about the current situation and scientific, communicating science has been, talking about logarithmic curves and the way in which people have, got to understand ways of presenting data on graphs, which maybe were not, are not immediately intuitive. The other thing I wanted to say was that it's important to have, a narrative that the data fits into, that the evidence fits into. And one of the problems that I found in one of my studies, looking at how people talk about problems related to car use, and people, in London, people are very aware of the problems caused by car use, air pollution and so on, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they then draw the conclusion that we need to restrict car use, and that often it's like we can't actually do anything about this problem because it'll just aggravate it, move it, it somehow cause more problems. So to give one example, somebody in the survey response said, well, the problem with 20-mile-an-hour limits is that drivers get frustrated and drive more dangerously and cause injuries. So, in a sense, any restriction on the power of the car then will come back and bite you. And I think the problem underlying that is that people struggle to believe that things can change. And part of that, to link back to an early comment, is around some of our planning tools and, for instance, transport models, and the way in which a lot of the tools, a lot of the methods we use do assume that there isn't the scope for substantial change. So maybe it's not surprising that the public don't believe that either, if the tools that we use are, assuming that there can't be substantial change. So, a narrative that suggests that not just change is necessary, but it's also possible, I think.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, and I think, the theme of communicating, well, we all recognise this from long-standing positions of how to communicate more effectively with the public. Mags W in the chat bar has sort of asked which group has the greatest power, the politicians or the media, and how is evidence presented to them. And when I was putting together my thoughts last night for the introductory remarks, I found a BBC article that said overnight airline bookings went up 600% after the Prime Minister's announcement. And I thought, 600% against what? And I rummaged around until I found a Guardian article that explained it was 600% compared to the day before, when everyone was still clearly in lockdown with no roadmap. It wasn't 600% compared to the same time last year, but those figures will, of course, be planted in people's minds as the bounce back is coming. We believe in the old normal and what we wanted, that freedom and choice and so on. So, you know, of course, communication is such a critical thing. And I love Gillian's idea that notwithstanding all of the bumps in the road in dealing with the pandemic, that we try and mimic that way that the government is regularly reporting to the public on a weekly basis, supported by the scientists, to say, how are we doing and how serious is the problem, which perhaps is a new way, and perhaps it is a link with COVID that could be more positive. Can I ask now for the panel to dig back into your thoughts from the various questions we've had from people in the audience beforehand? If you can be fairly quick fire and keep in mind, if you can, the link very much with COVID here. You know, is COVID that friend or foe? But if you'd each like to have a shot at some of the points that you found particularly eye-catching. Claire, would you like to start us off?
Thank you. Yes, and actually, I've got to share one thing, Glenn. I've had this idea. I'm looking at the Titanic and I'm thinking, how can the experience and everything that we've learned from COVID turn into a lifeboat? Just wanted to share that. So could you have? Sorry. I mean, no, I'm just thinking. I mean, one of the questions that jumped out for me was the idea, the question around how the conference sector. What's going to happen to conferences? Should we be doing everything online now? And actually connected to that, one of your initial questions in the initial framing, Glenn, you know, sort of what impact should all of this have on COVID? On COP26, on how that manifests. Because clearly, I mean, one of the big standout impacts has been this shift from, you know, for business travel more generally, to how easy it's been to sort of shift to this online format. And a big part of decarbonisation does need to be reducing the need to travel. You know, there's clearly efficiencies on every level, and COP26 could be an opportunity to showcase a whole new way of doing international conferences, with potentially reaching far wider audiences, you know, through live streaming. So, you know, a win. I mean, I think this is a bigger question, because I think the question about the future of conferences is linked to fundamentally the whole future of how and where we work and the future of our cities. And I think right now it's too early to say. I noticed somewhere in the chat somebody mentioned Goldman Sachs, suggesting that it isn't such a good idea to, you know, and I was actually pleased to see that, because I'm a fan of cities. I think people should get back together. Myself personally, that's my instinct on it. But you know, yesterday HSBC was announcing plans for a 40% cut in office space. So how's that going to work? You know, how's that going to work? So there clearly some companies are seeing efficiencies, others are seeing losing that water cooler moment. You know, the people being together. There's stuff that you can't replicate, and that's when often the most interesting and exciting ideas come, or when you're just randomly just filling up your coffee or at the water cooler. And there are clearly mental health aspects that we haven't really touched on today, but they are there, and that is looming large. That's going to be one of the big long COVID impacts, is the mental health. We are social beings. Zoom is often a poor substitute for genuine human contact. I mean, you know, when I was at Greener Journeys, we did some research that showed a third of people in the UK have deliberately caught the bus to have some human contact. I mean, it's clearly there is a link there. I mean, we do need to reduce, against this, we do need to reduce the need to travel. And I think that is something that we take, but that doesn't mean reducing direct social contact. So, you know, in planning, that might mean shifting to more, you know, urban villages, different ways where you can walk to work. I mean, I think when this pandemic is finally over, if it ever is over, we are going to need to find a new balance. This will impact on conferences, on business, on everything. There will need to be a new modus operandi. I mean, I think we will have learned a lot, and my hope is that we can take what's useful going forward and dump the rest.
That's great, thanks, Claire. And I do love the idea that if we carry on Zooming to fulfill our social animal instincts, we will all be getting on the buses for our local trips. So maybe there's a marriage there that we hadn't thought about. And yes, are we going to move from flight shaming to physical conference shaming? That will be an interesting thing to contemplate. Bob, what did you find from your look at the questions beforehand?
Gosh, yeah, I can't help but share on the conferences. So I've turned down all the physical face-to-face conferences that have been offered to me in recent days and weeks, and accepted pretty much most of those that are good, that are going to be online or allow me to make an online. I haven't got time. I haven't got time at the moment, to be traveling to these places. And I speak as somebody who, 10 years ago, I flew, I think, 2 or 3 times to my shame, I guess, to India to talk to them about how we'd set up the Office for Low Emission Vehicles and to share policy. And I was only there a day on each occasion. Absolutely shocking. Okay, so the questions. Moving on to questions. Okay, so I couldn't help but be tempted by the HS2 question. And how could anything that I or the rest of government how could that be taken seriously if the myth persisted that HS2 is somehow will have some kind of contribution to decarbonisation? Look, genuinely, I think it will. And economy-wide is important to measure that, not just as a transport thing. Because I think there's two aspects to it. There's rail capacity, and there's also it's a flipping huge infrastructure project. And with that comes all sorts of opportunities to drive some new behaviours, materials, new ways of doing things. I think on the capacity side, then that's huge for modal shift. Whenever I think apart from with the panel, too often I get into conversations about modal shift and then we're immediately talking about cars and bikes and arguing about that. Far bigger. If you look at transport and decarbonising the whole system, then actually this is about getting people off potentially domestic, or giving them a better choice perhaps between some of the short domestic flights and a high-speed rail journey. This is about looking at all of the trucks that are on our road. And I noticed through COVID, we've been publishing weekly stats on car, traffic. Those trucks, there are more journeys, there are more of them on our roads. But the more that we can then get them onto rail in the future, hint for the transport decarbonisation plan, perhaps, then they're better for us. I think they're better for space. There will be more space and less congestion, which is a huge driver for change, not just decarbonisation when we look at transport. So I think that is for me, just some of the reasons why HS2 is a good thing, increased rail capacity, and actually what it can do for building and construction and all of those emissions, which I in transport don't have to care about, but we do, of course, care about.
Oh, I love that answer. And I'm just imagining, I mean, of course, it's what would you do if you're in control? But I see the prospect that we've got new rail capacity even without HS2, because people are working from home who are the archetypal business travelers. So let's move people off the roads, off the SRN, onto that spare rail capacity, because we're going to need a pricing system anyway. So we can set the levers to do that. Let's use the SRN for movement of freight. So let's rebalance the multimodal transport system. But of course, to do that, we're going to need the carrots and sticks to be implemented at pace before everyone has their EV and is enjoying next to free mobility. Okay, thanks, Bob. Rachel, what took your interest from the questions?
Well, I was kind of intrigued by the framing question of has COVID-19 shifted the relative expectations of technological fix versus behaviour change in relation to decarbonisation? And one of the things that kind of intrigued me or piqued me was the fact that I don't really like either of those phrases. And behaviour change in particular, I find quite annoying because it's often used as a kind of suggestion that behaviour change means gently encourage people to do the right thing. Whereas really, I think behaviour change is about system change and about the fact that things need to be done very differently across the board. In terms of technological fixes, well, I think as the comments of many people in the chat have pointed out, replacing 30 million petrol and diesel cars by 30 million electric cars that is not going to solve things, and that is going, even getting there is going to be an enormous journey. And if we're talking about personal travel, then much of the technological fix things, if we leave aside sort of magical solutions like Hyperloop or whatever, much of the technological fixes require behaviour change at a range of levels. So it is easy to say, oh yes, we should have electric cars. And one thing that I often find is that people are asked to choose between policy options, and often they're often, some of the policy options in surveys, for instance, are outcomes, some are policies, some are vague aspirations. And so it is easy to say yes, we should have these things that involve technological change, but there's so many policy levers needed to get more electric cars in the fleet, even privately owned, but getting a more systemic change even more so. At the moment, we're seeing the rise of hybrid SUVs, electric SUVs. We're, in a sense, the new technology is being fitted into into the old problematic system. And many things that are technologically very, very easy in a sense, to restrict car speeds, with the debates around e-scooters and the problems caused by e-scooters, oh, let's restrict e-scooter speeds to 12 miles an hour in this area. Well, fine. But, we could actually do the same with much bigger, much more powerful vehicles. And we don't. So the technological fixes that we need, that we do need, require behaviour changes at a whole range of levels, not just individual, but also government, industry. We've made reference to lobbyists and so on. And as with the public, general vague encouragement isn't that effective with stakeholders. And just finally, to make reference to practices. So Bob referred at the end to freight and servicing. And I think it's really important to look at the way that some of the ways that systems, production and consumption systems are organised, make assumptions that people have car access and rely upon, cheap subsidised access to vehicles, to motor vehicles. And, those things are not just going to change by themselves. But if we look back a few decades, a lot of things that now we assume that people would have access to a van to do, weren't seen in the past as needing a van then, because there wasn't an assumption that that would be the case, and it wasn't supported by the system in the same way. So, it is possible to do things differently, but I don't think that will just happen.
That's great. Thanks, Rachel. And I must say I was very, very taken by your dislike for, I've been guilty of using technology fix versus behaviour change. And of course, the very notion of versus creates a polarisation rather than us all recognising that we need to have a collaborative approach, a multidisciplinary approach to addressing what ultimately is a socio-technical system. So yeah, maybe there's a lesson for all of us there, that we both different terminology, but a different mentality when we're tackling this, because I think otherwise it does become divisive, doesn't it? And anything you want to add on that, or do you have an alternative term or phrase that you might offer us? Perhaps I'll leave that thought with you. Okay, Andrew.
I'm going to go slightly
your attention.
I'm going to go slightly off script, actually, Glenn, just because I think the thing that was on my attention from we've already talked about from the list. But there's just been a fantastic discussion going on in the chat, and I'm just going to pull out a couple of thoughts from the chat which seem really interesting. There's been a really animated discussion about the relationship between transport and class, which is a kind of, one of those kind of elephants in the room whenever we talk about transport. There's also been, Goldman Sachs has been quoted in the chat, the Goldman Sachs boss saying, I want to get everybody back in the office as soon as I can, and obviously Claire was just talking about HSBC taking exactly the opposite view. And one of the things that really strikes me about this debate about work is that the companies which come out and say we're going to get everybody back in the office tend to be the most sociopathic companies in the world. That actually it's clearly not really about working arrangements, it's clearly about power and control. And I think, my general view, I take what Claire says about cities, but the city centre office market isn't coming back anytime soon. People will go into work. Work is going to be reorganised a bit, and I realise there's a class issue here. People who have got the options to choose where they work, how they work, what their arrangements are. But that's and I'm going to drag that back to buses, which I think Julian mentioned right at the beginning, because one of the questions in the chat is about how do we get to equitable access for buses. I think it's Jonathan Hampson said, that's almost the most important, equitable access for public transport, but probably buses are more important there. And obviously the current pandemic has just caused real problems for urban transport systems. And I was struck by that because I live quite close to a bus depot in London where there was a strike yesterday. And the reason there's a strike is that RATP that runs that franchise is trying to effectively cut pay by about 2,500 to bus drivers who feel that they worked through the crisis. Bus drivers died of COVID from working through the crisis. They don't really feel that RATP should be doing this. And obviously, if you look at our current models of how we run our bus service, it's a completely logical thing for RATP to do. They have a model that's based on fare revenues, and if they have less fare revenues, they need to find savings somewhere. And I was just struck, we've been talking about kind of looking at bigger picture, because I was struck that actually in France, for example, where I know municipalities have more freedoms, quite a lot of people have introduced free transport there. And the reason the way they've justified that is that the social benefits they get in terms of participation, social and economic, far outweigh the kind of costs of actually just subsidizing the fares in the bus system. So, we do need public transport. Pretty much every second comment in this list is, how do we actually make our public transport systems work? How do we make sure that people aren't sort of piling into cars? Cars are not the solution. There's also a comment on batteries, and one of the things we've talked about in our work, Glenn, is that actually batteries might be a constraint on actually the EV revolution, but there may not be enough battery technology out there to maintain the current car fleet if it was all electric. So this, if we're talking about how do we actually make this work, I think actually there should be the opportunity for some relatively radical discussions about what the broader benefits are of social, economic, cultural, leisure benefits are of effective, low cost, even free transport systems, which actually deal with this problem, that if actually otherwise we're going to end up in some rather old-fashioned conversations about how do you pay for bus systems out of fares if actually people are still anxious about traveling and they're being discouraged from using them, and they're not so keen, and they don't have to go in quite the same numbers into the city centre anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, the issue, incidentally, I love I'm not sure it will make a headline in any of Rupert Murdoch's papers, but sociopathic employers, watch out for those when you're applying for jobs. But of course, it is almost the antithesis of the types of headlines that are thrown at us as the general public very, very regularly. And of course, the same has been true to some extent of public transport, where we actually know there's as much science saying that public transport has been wrongly victimized as an epicenter of super spreading, as there is to imagine it might be. So let's hope the science comes back to the fore on that, because as one of the comments in the chat bar says, people are going to be rushing back to the pubs, rushing back into supermarkets. So why wouldn't they be rushing back onto buses in terms of social distancing? Now, we seem to have lost Brendan for the moment. So I'm not sure whether that's got anything to do with his mention of the 20% reduction in car kilometres in Scotland, which I was very keen to hear a bit more about, because I think it's one of the most fantastic policies, which has almost floated under the radar. It certainly feels to me. So Gillian, without putting you on the spot, if you'd like to add in anything you can say about that 20% kilometre reduction that you're aware of, alongside what you'd like to react to from the audience.
Well, the 20% reduction figure, I believe, comes out of quite a lot of research that Transport Scotland has commissioned on how to get the transport sector to meet its carbon reduction targets in Scotland. And as I sort of intimated before, you don't really need a sophisticated model, but there isn't a modelling exercise.
Sorry, Gillian, just to cut in for a moment. I don't know whether everyone else has got their microphone muted, but if we could please, I think somewhere we're getting some feedback. Carry on, Gillian.
As I was saying before, there isn't a modelling exercise that I've seen that is looking at Paris-compliant pathways and budgets, not just the 2050 endpoint, that doesn't suggest that we need significant cuts in car use by 2030. And so, in a way, the work that Scotland have done and commissioned has really left them no choice if they're actually wanting to say that they're going to meet their targets. And we have to remember that for surface transport, we're talking about absolute zero. We're not talking about zero. The net bit, which that's a whole different conversation about whether we should have that at all in there, but the net bit is reserved for aviation and for land use change. It's got nothing to do with surface transport. And so this is about getting to absolute zero for transport.
Okay, Gillian, I'm going to cut in there, sorry, but there's a lot of feedback. I don't know whether others are picking it up, whether we can just leave you to see whether there's a microphone reset you could do. But just while you're looking at that, I just wonder whether, I'm very conscious, often one comes back to the point of the importance of communication. And I'm aware that some of us spend an awful lot of time communicating with each other on Twitter and LinkedIn and the like. Any thoughts from the panel about how we might approach communicating differently the wealth of knowledge that exists within this forum and elsewhere with those people that matter. Now, whether that's the public or the politicians or both, how do we do things differently? Because carrying on doing what we've always done seems to be getting what we've always got. Gillian.
Can I try again?
It's not good, I'm afraid, but we can hear you, but you've gone very growly. Sorry. Well, let's move across the panel, but whether things will improve. Sorry, Gillian. Anyone else on what could we do differently with communication, or perhaps you feel we are starting to do differently that might make a difference? Rachel.
Just very briefly, I think I always feel quite sorry for local councillors, because I think it's an incredibly difficult job, and it's a lot of work and it's not very much money. And I think you can't necessarily expect the local councillors, even the transport leads, are going to have an understanding of some of these issues. So I think getting the message to those people and explaining some of the issues and making sure that they're ready to experience, to respond to criticisms that they may get and they feel informed is actually really important.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Just learned from Brogan that we seem to have lost Brendan, unfortunately. So we're not too far away from the finish line, but it looks like some of our runners and riders are having difficulties. Right, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I do want to make sure each of you have a little bit of time to reflect on what you think the takeaway message is from what's actually been a very challenging conversation. I don't suppose it's been a surprise to us just how many dimensions to this there are. And I do feel guilty. I'm glad panel members have been tracking the chat bar as well, because the great value of these fireside chats is that there's as much going on within the chat itself as we're exchanging with each other and with the audience. So I mean, part of me feels it's a case that we just need to hold our nerve and have that resolve that this is going to continue to be a very, very difficult journey. It's going to be very challenging for all the reasons we've talked about. But the only thing we can do is each of us to give our 110% effort to play our part in the journey, and hoping that it will become an S-curve of change, picking up momentum and starting to coalesce in the direction that really matters for us. But can I just come to each of you in turn to sort of have your last go at the mic in terms of what you would like to say, reflecting on the session. And if there is, it's very difficult, but if there is a takeaway message that you'd leave the audience with, or perhaps take away yourselves. Andrew, you'd like to start us off.
Let me just unmute myself. One of the models I used to use when I worked for the Henley Centre was called The World, Our World and My World. And one of the things we learned about sustainability when we researched it in the 2000s was that actually you needed to drive it from the world to my world. Climate change is a kind of classic the world type idea. And one of the things I've actually been encouraged by this conversation, since I know we're all clutching at straws a bit here, but one of the things I've been encouraged by in this conversation is the conversation about well-being. I think one of the things that the pandemic has done has renewed the focus on the importance of well-being. And that kind of aligns with strong trends which were there before the pandemic. And one of the outcomes of greener transport, whether that's more active travel, whether that's reduced cars, whatever, is actually improved well-being for everybody. It's actually even a stronger effect in poorer communities than richer communities, because actually they tend to bear the brunt of worse noise pollution, worse air pollution. So I think, my takeaway from this conversation is being actually we need to make the conversation about climate change, bring that back to the post-pandemic conversation about well-being, because I think that's a point where people actually can identify real benefits for themselves and their families, kind of brings it into kind of the our world and my world.
Yeah, that seems very powerful, Andrew. I guess there's a question over whether that's widely enough understood and what capabilities we've got collectively to really bring that to bear, on how we are communicating with others. Who would like to step up next? I can move along the line, but if anyone would like to have a go, what have you made from Claire? Oh, we're not hearing it. That's it.
Yeah, and I'm happy to go next. I mean, can I just thank you again for bringing us all together? I mean, my response right at this point is probably more of an emotive one. And I know you and I, Glenn, Gillian, we've talked about how we have to believe that it's possible to address this challenge. We really do have to believe. And we are here in a moment of time. I want to go back to the Titanic or the lifeboat. We are here in a moment in time. I mean, we've learned so much through COVID. I mean, you know, and we're still in it and it's still horrible, but we have learned a lot. We do need to grasp this because, well, I mean, we just have to, we have to. And I suppose if that's probably it really. I think the message that I want to leave and that I want to take is framing it in that we can do this and think hope, half full, what we can do. We have to, or we won't keep going. But there is cause for hope, and there are things that are beginning to change. And the S curve you talk about, and that there will be exponential changes. And if we just each play our part, in producing the evidence and feeding into the debate where we can constructively, giving support to politicians making difficult decisions, facing angry, media and what have you. That all of that needs to be worked through. But to just believe that it's possible, I think is my message. That we can do this.
That's great, thanks, Claire. And I'll perhaps leave a question back with you, not to address now, but I think we don't have the answer, of course, but I wonder how long the right length of the pandemic in terms of the real incarceration and lockdown should have been to get the optimal benefit from it. And of course, all the awful things that have happened, but the benefit in terms of this agenda for the future. There was a sense that maybe it hadn't gone on long enough to start with and we would have bounced back very quickly. But now we've got to this state where everyone is sort of so over it and desperate to get back to interaction that we may lose some of the opportunity we had. Who knows? And of course, we don't know how much longer ahead we really have. Who'd like to have a go next? And let's try Gillian again. And Gillian, we will go with you anyway, even if there's a little bit of growl in the background.
Okay, I did have a bit of a change around. Can you hear me?
Much better. Thank you.
Great. I think the thing that's come out of this discussion for me is the idea that we could really benefit from a bringing together of minds on this question about how to communicate. Because I do think we've learned a lot, and I think we almost take for granted the fact that the Daily Mails are out there and are going to say certain things, and yet they've actually been calling for carbon taxes across all sectors, and so things are changing. And one of the things I wanted to mention was that I've had quite a lot to do with the climate assemblies around the country, both the national ones in Scotland and the Climate Assembly UK, and also many of the local assemblies. And what really strikes me about those discussions is that you get much further, this is fairly obvious, but you get much further when you talk about the trade-offs and the well-being outcomes and the distribution of losers and winners than you do talking about individual policy instruments. So if you go in with a discussion about road user charging, or you go in with a discussion about banning SUVs earlier than later, and you go in with single ideas, then it's a no from most people. If you go in with the idea and you say, look, we've got to get to this point and we need a route map, not a road map, we need a route map because it's got to be multimodal. And it's going to involve lots of different levers that we've got to pull. And the thing is that if we don't want to pull the really difficult ones later on because we miss our targets, we don't want to pull the really difficult ones like big pricing or road closures, then the earlier today we do some things like ban SUVs, the better will be the chances that we'll have fewer restrictions on where we're driving. And that kind of trade-off really works. And that is the truth of it. And that is the problem of a lot of policy communication and a lot of politicians running fearful, local and national, because they think in terms of individual policy instruments.
That's great.
We've got to actually think the bigger picture.
Thank you, Gillian. No, I think that's some very important points there. Bob and Rachel, I'm going to have to squeeze you in rapidly to the finish, a bit of bad time management on my part. So Rachel, would you like to go first in terms of your closing comments?
Yeah, very quickly, yes, the importance of talking about those wider issues, not just about individual policies, and the fact that there's a lot of talk about what streets are for, and who should, for instance, research from UCL showing that most footways are not wide enough for people to pass each other with enough space in terms of COVID physical distancing, but that opens up a conversation about what our streets are for, what our carriageways are for, who they're for. That I find this very positive. Obviously, it's quite often quite polarised and controversial, but the fact that we're discussing some of those issues, discussing whether we should be giving so much of our streets over to car storage, for instance, I think is really important.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And Bob.
Gosh, right, okay then. This isn't easy. This is definitely not easy, but neither has the last year. We've come together as a nation, to tackle, not quite yet to beat COVID, but we're about to do that. So we can do this as well. It's a bigger challenge. It's across the globe, but we really can do it. And to hone in on transport, hopefully this spring, the transport decarbonisation will come out, and that will set out the steps that we think are needed to get us to zero, not net zero, to zero in transport. Okay, so please, there won't be everything for everybody in there. It's impossible to do that, but please, if we all get behind it and try and deliver it, we can actually do this.
That's great, thanks, Bob. And I'm just going to wrap up very quickly before I pass back to Brogan. I'm going to read out actually the last comment in the chat bar from Mags, because I think it's a very poignant remark to finish on. And I think it applies to all of us, incidentally, not just those on the panel. But she says, Claire and all the panelists, please be encouraged. You are making a difference and changes are happening. The message is getting out there. Keep moving forwards towards the tipping point. So thank you very much, Mads. I think quite right. You really captured the essence of where we got to this afternoon. And with that, huge thank you to our panel and to you, the audience. And just briefly, if you'll stick with us, back to Brogan for our sign off this afternoon.
Yeah, just a quick thank you. It was a great discussion. The chat was amazing. And thank you to our panelists and Glenn. And we'll see you April 15th is our next event. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.